Hang poured the tea with both hands, the way a respectful daughter-in-law should, and she smiled at the room full of relatives, the way a woman smiles when she already knows how the afternoon is going to end. Mother-in-law spent her whole life doing the cooperative's accounting, she said, setting the teapot down gently, her voice carrying that particular softness that fills a room without appearing to try. Decades of adding up other people's numbers. What could she have left behind that's worth very much? She laughed, light and easy, the laugh of someone sharing an obvious truth. Let us younger ones handle the difficult things. You've earned your rest, mother. Calculating things at your age only exhausts the mind. The room rippled with the small sounds of agreement. An aunt near the window nodded. Two cousins exchanged glances that meant nothing unkind, just the comfortable agreement of people who find it easier to laugh along than to think carefully. Hang's brother Koa, sitting beside her with his back very straight and his hands folded on the table, smiled at his teacup. I set my own cup down. Not hard, not with any particular emphasis. I simply set it down on the lacquered tray the way I had set things down on that same tray for 40 years. With the steadiness of hands that had spent 3 decades entering figures into ledgers that could not afford to be wrong, and I looked at my daughter-in-law across the anniversary table spread with food I had cooked since 5 in the morning, incense rising from the altar behind me in 3 thin threads past my husband's photograph, and I smiled. Half a smile, the left side only, the kind that doesn't explain itself. Hang's smile held for a breath longer than it should have. Then she turned back to the room and said something else, something about arrangements, about how the family was lucky to have young people willing to take on burdens the old couldn't manage anymore, and the room nodded again, and someone refilled the tea, and the conversation moved on the way. Conversations do at family gatherings when no one wants to be the one who asks the question that changes everything. No one asked why I was smiling. That was all right. I had not expected them to. It was the first death anniversary of my mother-in-law, a woman named Tran Thi Muo, who had lived in this house for 83 years and died in the back bedroom with the window open and the sound of rain on the tin roof, the way she had always said she wanted, and I had known her for 42 years, longer than some of the people at this table had been alive. She had taught me to make the sour soup she liked on cold mornings. She had sat beside me at this same altar when my husband died 7 years ago, her hand over mine on the incense holder, saying nothing, because she understood that some grief doesn't need company so much as it needs a person willing to sit inside it. She had also, 15 years ago on a Tuesday afternoon in the dry season, pressed my hand the same way she had pressed it at my husband's funeral, and said something to me that I had kept in a place no one in this room knew existed. I thought about that Tuesday as Hang finished speaking and the table settled into the comfortable noise of a meal. Chopsticks against bowls, someone telling a story about the road into town, a child asking to be excused. I thought about the smell of the afternoon 15 years ago, the particular smell of dry dust and old wood and the gardenia bush outside the window of Mother's room, and her voice, which had been strong even then, clear and deliberate in the way of a woman who has decided something and wants to be certain it is understood. She had said, "There are things I know about that woman your son married that you do not know yet. And there are things I am going to do about them before I am no longer here to do anything." And then she had told me what those things were. And then she had told me where. I had not told anyone. Not my son Loy, who trusted his wife the way a man trusts the person he chose to trust and finds it easier to keep trusting than to ask why he should. Not my neighbor Bafuak, who knew me better than almost anyone alive and who was sitting 3 seats down the table even now, talking to someone's aunt, her eyes finding mine every few minutes, with the small, careful attention of a woman who has watched over someone for 30 years and knows when something is being held. Not even the jasmine plant on the kitchen windowsill, which had heard more of my private thoughts than any person had in 7 years of widowhood. I had kept the secret the way Mother asked me to keep it, in exactly the way she specified, and I had spent 15 years tending it the way I tended her altar, with the same steadiness, the same refusal to be rushed, the same understanding that some things have their proper time and produce nothing useful before it arrives. The incense burned down at its own pace. You did not hurry it. Across the table, Hoa leaned toward his sister and said something too low to hear, and Hang's expression shifted for a fraction of a second into something that had no softness in it at all, before she arranged her face back into its pleasant shape and reached for the teapot again. I watched her pour. Her hands were steady. She was confident, genuinely confident, the confidence of a person who has prepared carefully and verified all the relevant details and believes the afternoon is already finished in the way she planned it. She was not wrong that the afternoon would be finished. She was wrong about how. The food was good. I had made everything myself. The dishes Mother had loved. The sticky rice with the green bean filling she'd asked for every year since I married into this family. The braised pork with the dark sweet sauce that took 4 hours, and which Hang had once suggested I stop making because it was too much trouble for a woman my age. I had made it anyway. I made it every year. Some things you keep doing not because they are easy but because they belong to the person you are keeping faith with. Outside, the wind moved through the old longan tree in the courtyard, the tree Mother's husband had planted before the war, before any of us were part of this family, its roots going down into the same ground where 3 generations of the Tran family had lived and died and been remembered. The sound it made was the same sound it had always made, patient, indifferent to the particular concerns of any single afternoon. I had spent 42 years in this family, learning the difference between the things that could be hurried and the things that could not. Numbers on a page could be worked quickly or slowly depending on what accuracy required. Trust took as long as it took. Justice, real justice, the kind that holds because it is built on something true rather than something convenient, moved at its own pace entirely and could not be pushed into arriving before it was ready without becoming something lesser than itself. Mother had known that. She had planned accordingly. I picked up my tea and drank it, while Hang spoke to the room about arrangements, her voice warm and organized and certain, and I thought of still water, of the deep kind that shows you only its surface, that gives nothing away about what moves below, that has been patient since long before anyone thought to look at it, and will be patient long after they have stopped. The deepest water never announces itself. My grandmother had told me when I was a girl too impatient to understand why some things could not be forced. It simply waits, and when it moves, everything moves with it. I set down my cup. I smiled my half-smile at no one in particular. I was ready to move. My husband's name was Tran Van Min, and he smelled of engine grease and rice wine on the evenings. He came home late from helping the neighbors fix their irrigation pump, and he called me cook the way no one else ever did, without the formal tone people used at the cooperative, just my name, plain and familiar, like something he had carried in his pocket for years and reached for, without thinking. We married in 1978, the year the longan tree in the courtyard produced so much fruit that Mother made preserves for 3 months and still gave half away to the lane. I was 26. He was 29. The ceremony was small because there was not money for anything large, but Mother cooked for 2 days and the neighbors came anyway, the way neighbors came to everything in those years, because community was the only abundance anyone reliably had. I moved into this house as a daughter-in-law, the way young women moved into houses then, carrying my clothes in a cloth bundle and my accounting textbooks in a separate bag, because I had just been assigned to the cooperative, and I intended to keep working regardless of what anyone thought about married women and ledgers. Mother looked at those textbooks the first evening, when I was arranging them on the shelf in the room she had prepared for us, and she said nothing critical. She simply nodded, the small, firm nod of a woman who has made up her mind about something, and went back to the kitchen. That nod was the beginning of 42 years of understanding between us. I worked at the cooperative for 31 years. Inventory accounts, payroll, quarterly tax filings that changed their categories every few years just to remind accountants that no system was permanent. I was the only woman in the accounting room for the first 8 years. Then they hired another, a young woman from the next village who was nervous about her sums, and I spent 2 years teaching her to trust the numbers rather than fear them. Numbers did not lie if you were honest with them. That was the fundamental principle. Everything else was commentary. Min repaired engines. Agricultural machinery mostly, the tillers and threshers that the cooperative used, but also motorcycles for the families on our lane, and occasionally the ancient French-era water pump that the district office kept promising to replace and never did. His hands were always darker than the rest of him, the grease working into the skin in lines that soap could clean but not entirely erase. I used to look at those hands across the dinner table, and think that they were the most honest hands I had ever seen, the hands of a man who fixed what was broken rather than hiding that it was broken. We had 3 children. The oldest, Loy, grew into his father's quietness and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure, which made him a reliable man who was sometimes immovable in ways that exhausted everyone around him. The second, a daughter named Dao, moved south after her marriage, and called on Sundays with the particular cheerfulness of someone who has built a life elsewhere and needs both themselves and you to believe it was the right choice. The youngest, a son named Fook, died at 19 in a motorcycle accident on the road to the district town. And that loss reshaped every year that came after it the way a flood reshapes the bed of a river. Not destroying it, but ensuring it is never quite the same shape again. Min died 7 years ago. Heart failure, the doctor said, which seemed too simple a phrase for the way it happened. The way he came in from the courtyard one morning and sat down in his chair at the kitchen table and was simply gone by the time I reached him, his tea cooling in front of him, the chair still pushed out at the angle he always sat, tilted back slightly, the way I had told him 100 times would break the legs eventually. The chair still sits at that angle. I have not straightened it. Mother was alive then, and she was the one who sat with me through the worst of it, the way I said she had sat with me at the altar, her hand over mine, her silence the kind that holds, rather than the kind that abandons. She was 76 that year and already slowing, the particular slowing of a body that has worked hard and is beginning to negotiate with what it can still ask of itself. But she was clear. Her mind was as sharp as it had ever been, sharper maybe, the way old accountants get, when decades of practice have made the essential calculations automatic and left the mind free for other observations. She watched Loy's wife carefully in those years. I know because I watched Mother watching, which was its own kind of accounting, tracking a column of small entries that individually meant little but accumulated over time into a figure that demanded attention. The way Hang rearranged the kitchen without asking. The way she referred to the house in conversations with her friends as their place, not her husband's family's place. Not a more complicated word that acknowledged the complexity of what it was. The way her brother Hoa appeared at the house with increasing frequency after Min died, always helpful, always smiling, always somehow present in the front room where the family documents were kept in the wooden cabinet beneath the window. I noticed, Mother noticed. We did not yet speak of it directly, the way you do not speak directly of a smell in a house until you have found its source, because speaking too soon only sends it somewhere you cannot see. The house itself was constant through all of this. The same tin roof that rang in the rain, the same courtyard where the longan tree grew older and produced less fruit each year but continued producing, stubbornly, in the manner of things that have been somewhere long enough to believe they belong. The same altar in the main room where photographs accumulated, the way they accumulate in a family that keeps losing people, my husband now beside his father. His father beside his father's parents, all of them watching the room with the particular expression photographs give the dead, calm and permanent, and entirely without opinion about what happens below them. I cleaned that altar every morning. Incense at dawn, fresh water, the small rituals that are less about belief than about maintenance, about keeping something tended that deserves to be tended. Mother had done it before me. I had taken it over without discussion the year she turned 80, when her knees made the kneeling difficult, and she had watched me do it the first morning without comment, which was how she gave her approval to things she approved of deeply. Those mornings at the altar were when I thought most clearly. No other sound in the house yet, only the birds beginning outside and the incense smoke rising, and the photographs of the dead looking out at the courtyard through the open window. It was in those mornings, over many years, that I had learned to distinguish between the problems that required action and the problems that required patience, and to understand that getting them confused was the source of most of the mistakes I had seen people make in 31 years of watching a cooperative's accounts drift toward disaster. There were things you moved on quickly, or they escaped you, and there were things you left alone until the right moment came, because touching them too soon only collapsed them. Mother had understood this better than anyone I had ever known. She had spent 83 years living it, and in the 15th year before she died, on that Tuesday afternoon with the gardenia smell and the dry season light coming through her window, she had applied that understanding to a problem she had been watching for a very long time, and she had done something about it in the quietest and most permanent way available to her. I had been tending that secret the way I tended the altar, every morning, without fail. Waiting for the morning, when the waiting would be finished. I did not know then, when the anniversary dinner ended and the relatives filed out into the evening and Hang walked through the house with the proprietary ease of a woman who believes a place is already hers, that the morning was closer than I had yet allowed myself to think. But I noticed, clearing the dishes, that the wooden cabinet beneath the front room window was sitting a half-inch further from the wall than it had been that morning. 3 days after the anniversary dinner, I found the envelope. Not the important one. That one had been somewhere safe for 15 years and would remain there until I chose otherwise. This was a different envelope, a small brown one that had been tucked into the back of the wooden cabinet beneath the front room window, behind the folder of household registration papers and the old land tax receipts from the years when such things were filed on paper rather than entered into a district database. I had put it there myself 2 years ago, a copy of the cooperative's retirement letter confirming my pension. Nothing sensitive, nothing anyone would want, but I kept it there because I kept everything organized, and its place was there, and I had always known exactly where everything in that cabinet was. The envelope was not where I had put it. It was there, still, but shifted, the way the cabinet itself had shifted, with the slightly wrong placement of something returned by a person who was careful but not careful enough, who knew the general location but not the precise one. I stood in the front room in the early morning, the altar incense just lit behind me, the light still gray through the courtyard window, and I held the envelope and looked at where it had been, and measured the distance between those two positions, and understood that someone had gone through this cabinet recently and tried to make it look as though they hadn't. I put the envelope back in its correct place. I did not mention it to anyone. That week, Hang began coming by the house more frequently than she had before. This was new. In the years since my mother-in-law's decline had made regular visits expected, Hang had come dutifully on Sundays, sometimes Saturday afternoons, often with Loy, when he was home from the welding contract that kept him away most of the month. But now she came on Tuesday morning, then Thursday afternoon, then the following Monday before I had finished my breakfast, knocking with the cheerful insistence of a woman who considers herself at home in a place, and therefore beyond the need to time her arrivals. She always had a reason. She was dropping off fruit from the market. She wanted to check that the roof wasn't leaking after the rain. She thought she'd left her reading glasses on her last visit, though she did not appear to be looking for them with any urgency. Each reason was plausible and small and complete in itself, the way individual entries in a fraudulent ledger are each individually plausible if you only look at one at a time and never add the column. I had spent 31 years adding columns. I began keeping notes in the small red notebook I used for household accounts, the one that lived in my apron pocket, and that Hang would have no reason to look at even if she went through every cabinet in the house. Date, time, stated reason for visit, rooms entered, duration. The entries accumulated with the same patience that entries always accumulated, one line at a time, until the pattern became visible the way patterns always became visible when you were willing to keep recording long enough to see them. She spent time in the front room. That was consistent across every visit. She would move through the house, into the kitchen for tea, sometimes to the back bedroom that had been Mother's and that I had not yet rearranged, but she always returned to the front room, always spent a few minutes there near the cabinet or near the old writing desk in the corner, where Mother had kept her personal correspondence in the years she still wrote letters by hand. Hoa came twice that month, once with Hang, once alone, on a Wednesday afternoon when he said he was passing through on his way to the district office for work matters and had stopped to pay his respects to the altar. He was polite. He was always polite. He had the particular politeness of a person in a service profession who has learned to make every interaction feel personal, while giving away nothing that is actually personal, and he sat with me for 20 minutes drinking tea and asking after my health and Loy's work contract and whether the longan tree had produced well this year. I answered his questions. I watched his eyes. They went twice to the wooden cabinet beneath the window in the 20 minutes he sat there, quick glances, the kind you make when you are trying not to make them, which is always the surest way to make them visible to anyone paying attention. After he left, I checked the cabinet. Nothing moved this time. He had looked but not touched, or had touched and been more careful than before. I could not determine which. That Saturday, Ba Foi came over with sweet potatoes from her garden. The way she came over once a week with whatever her garden was producing. And we sat in the courtyard under the longan tree and I told her, not everything, but enough to ask the question I needed to ask without revealing why I needed to ask it. I asked her whether she had noticed Koa's car parked in front of the house on any days she hadn't seen me receive him. She was quiet for a moment in the way she was quiet when she was deciding how much of something she already knew to say. Twice, she said finally. Once about 3 weeks ago, on a morning you had gone to the market. He was here for almost an hour. I thought you knew. I thought about that hour. The market on that morning had taken me 40 minutes. I had stopped to talk to the woman who sold dried mushrooms, which had added perhaps another 15. Koa had arrived after I left and been gone before I returned, which meant he had either watched the house and timed his arrival, or he had come expecting me to be home and found his opportunity when I wasn't, which was in some ways a worse possibility because it suggested readiness rather than planning. I didn't know, I said. Bafwook looked at me with the directness of a woman who has been your neighbor for 30 years and knows better than to soften things you need to hear clearly. Cuck, she said. What are they looking for? I poured more tea. I considered the question the way I considered difficult entries, from every angle, looking for the interpretation that accounted for all the evidence without requiring any piece of it to be ignored. What they were looking for, I was increasingly certain, was the same thing everyone who goes through someone else's cabinet is always looking for. Evidence of what existed, confirmation of what could be taken, the location of whatever was worth taking. What they did not know, and what I had no intention of helping them discover, was that what they were looking for was not in this house, had never been in this house. Mother had been wiser than that. I don't know yet, I told Bafwook, which was true in the sense that I did not yet know the exact shape of what they planned, even if I was beginning to understand its outline the way you understand the outline of a structure in the dark, not by seeing it clearly but by the way it blocks the light. She nodded. She did not press me. That was the thing about Bafwook. She knew when a question had been answered as completely as it was going to be answered, and she accepted that without offense. I walked her to the gate when she left, and stood watching her cross the lane to her own house, the late afternoon turning the dust golden, a motorcycle somewhere down the road, the ordinary sounds of a neighborhood at the end of a day. Then I went back inside and sat at the kitchen table with my red notebook open in front of me, and wrote the date and Bafwook's information, and added it to the column. Then I turned to a fresh page and began, for the first time, to write down not just what they were doing but what I believed they were planning to do with whatever they found. The list, when I finished it, was longer than I had expected, and at the bottom of it, almost as an afterthought, I wrote a question I had been avoiding for 2 weeks because I did not yet want to face its implications. If they were this certain, this systematic, this careful about confirming what documents existed in this house, it could only mean one thing. They already had something they believed could replace those documents. The answer to the question I had written at the bottom of that page came sooner than I expected. And from a direction I had not thought to watch. It came from Loy. My son called on a Thursday evening, later than his usual time, and there was something in his voice from the first word that did not match his ordinary Thursday evenings, the tired but steady voice of a man who has worked with his hands all day and is calling his mother from a rented room before sleeping. This voice was careful, measured in a way that suggested the words had been arranged before the call was made. "Ma," he said, "I've been thinking we should sort out the paperwork on grandmother's house. Now that she's gone, it needs to be properly transferred. Hang says it's better to do these things early before any complications come up." I was sitting at the kitchen table. The evening light was coming through the back window at the low angle that turned everything in the kitchen amber, the color it had been every evening for 40 years, and I looked at that light on the familiar surfaces of the room and kept my voice the same as it always was. "What kind of complications?" I asked. "Just administrative things. Documents, registration. Hang's brother works near the notary office. He can help make it simple." A pause. She said she might have already started looking into what's needed. Might have already started. Past tense dressed as present tense, the way you speak when the thing has already happened, and you need the other person to believe it is only being considered. "I see," I said. "There's no hurry, Loy. These things can be done properly." Of course, of course. Just when you have time. We talked for a few more minutes about his work, about the contract schedule, about whether he would be home before the month ended. He sounded relieved when we moved away from the paperwork topic, the relief of a man who has delivered a message he was uncomfortable delivering and is glad to have it behind him. When we said goodbye, I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after the call ended, listening to the amber kitchen be quiet around me. Hong had sent Loy to tell me, which meant she was far enough along in whatever she was planning that she needed me to begin expecting the conversation, to have time to grow accustomed to the idea before the documents appeared. It was a preparation strategy. I had seen it in the cooperative, in the years before a supplier would raise prices, the casual mentions of costs increasing, of difficulties in the supply chain, said early and often enough that by the time the invoice arrived with the new figures, your resistance had already been softened by anticipation. She was softening me, which meant the invoice was coming soon. The next morning I went to see Ba Phuoc before she left for the market, which meant arriving before 7, which meant the dew was still on the vegetables she kept in pots along her front wall, and the lane was quiet except for the early motorcycle traffic heading toward town. She opened the door before I knocked, the way she often did, some sensitivity to footsteps on her lane that I had stopped questioning years ago. I told her about Loy's call. She listened, and I watched her face for the reaction I was looking for. The particular expression of someone who is hearing confirmation of something they already suspected. She had it. The notary office, she said. Koa works with the private one on Hung Vuong Street, not the state one. The private office has processed some things in the past few years that people have had questions about. She said it carefully, the way she said things she wanted me to hear precisely. Documents that moved quickly. Faster than documents usually move. What kind of documents? Transfer documents. Inheritance settlements. She looked at me steadily. One family in the next ward had a situation. An old woman. Her children disputed a will. There was a document that appeared from that office, properly stamped and certified, that no one in the family could account for. The case went to the district court. It took 2 years. 2 years. And that family had known immediately that something was wrong, had had other family members to dispute alongside them. I was one person, living alone, with a son who trusted his wife and a daughter in the south who called on Sundays. Did they resolve it? I asked. Eventually, the original was found. She paused. But not everyone is lucky enough to have an original to find. I walked home through the lane in the morning light, past the house with the painted gate, and the house where the old schoolteacher had lived before his children moved him to the city, past the gap where the storm had taken down a fence 3 years ago and the new fence was already weathering to match the old. I knew every detail of this lane, the way you know a thing you have walked past every day for 40 years without deciding to memorize it, the knowledge settling in without effort. At home, I made tea and sat at the front room table and thought about documents that moved quickly, about a notary office where things could be made to appear, properly stamped and certified, about Koa's position, his access, his particular usefulness to a plan that required paperwork to move through channels that most people would not know how to navigate without someone on the inside. I thought about what document, specifically, would need to appear. A will. It would have to be a will. Mother had died without any public record of having made one, because the real one existed only in a lawyer's office that Hang and Koa did not know about and had no reason to look for. In the absence of a known will, inheritance would proceed by default family law, which would give Loy a share alongside the surviving daughters-in-law and any other legitimate claimants. Not everything. Not the clean, complete transfer that Hang wanted. But if a will appeared, a document, properly formatted, properly stamped, bearing mother's name and the notary seal of a private office that processed things quickly, leaving everything to Loy as the eldest son's household, to be managed by his wife as household representative since Loy was away for work. It would be challenged, of course. If anyone knew to challenge it. If anyone had standing to challenge it. If anyone had anything to challenge it with. I sat with my tea and let the morning come fully into the room and thought about these things with the same methodical attention I had given to 3 decades of figures that needed to be right. Then I went to the altar and lit the incense and stood for a moment looking at my husband's photograph, and then at the photograph of mother beside him, and I thought about the Tuesday afternoon 15 years ago, and the gardenia smell and her clear, deliberate voice, and I thought about where she had told me to go if the day ever came when I needed what she had prepared. That afternoon, I dressed in my good clothes, the dark blouse I wore for official occasions, and I took the bus to the district town. I had not been to that particular street in 4 years, but the address had not changed, and neither had the wooden sign above the door, weathered now, the characters slightly faded, but still entirely legible. I pushed open the door and went inside. The man at the desk looked up, and I recognized him immediately, though he had aged, as we all had, in 15 years, and I could see from his expression that he recognized me too, and that my arrival, while not expected today, was not entirely a surprise to him, as though he had understood for some time that this visit was coming, and had only been waiting to learn which day it would be. He began to speak, but before he could, his desk phone rang, and he held up one hand in apology and answered it, and I watched his face change as he listened, the color shifting in a way that made me set down my bag very carefully on the chair beside me. When he hung up, he looked at me for a moment before he spoke. "Someone filed a document at the district land registry this morning," he said, "under your mother-in-law's name." His name was Bui the Hung, and he had been a lawyer for 38 years, and in all of those years, sitting across from him in his small office with the wooden shelves, and the smell of old paper and ink that reminded me of the cooperative's archive room, I had never seen his face look the way it looked in the moment after he set down that phone. Not frightened, not angry, controlled. The way a person is controlled when they need to think clearly and every instinct they have is trying to move faster than thinking allows. He told me what the phone call had contained, in the precise, economical way of a man who has spent decades translating complicated situations into plain language for people who needed to understand them without being overwhelmed by them. Someone had submitted a document to the district land registry that morning. A will, presented as the last testament of Tron Thi Moi, deceased 11 months prior. The document named Tron Van Looy, eldest son, as sole heir to all property registered under the deceased's name, including the house, the courtyard, and the land parcel behind it extending to the irrigation canal. The submission had been made by an agent acting on behalf of the heir, and the agent had provided a notarized power of attorney authorizing him to act in this capacity. The agent's name was Du Ming Koa. I sat with that for a moment. The morning light came through the single window of the office at a low angle that put half the desk in shadow, and I looked at the shadowed half and breathed in the smell of old paper and let the information settle into its proper place in the column I had been building for weeks. They had moved. The Thursday phone call from Loy, which I had understood as preparation, as softening, had in fact been cover, something to occupy my attention and give me a benign explanation for the administrative activity that was already in motion by the time he called me. While I was sitting in my amber kitchen telling Loy there was no hurry, Hoa had already been preparing to file. "I need to see the document," I said. "I've requested a copy from my contact at the registry. It will take until this afternoon." He folded his hands on the desk. "Cuck, I have to ask you something directly. How many people knew about what your mother-in-law did 15 years ago? You, me, no one else." "You're certain?" She was certain. She told me she had told no one, and I believed her then, and I believe it now. He nodded. The slow nod of a man confirming something he already suspected. "Then whoever filed this document doesn't know it exists. They filed because they believe there is no will. They believe they are filling an absence. They're wrong." "Yes." He looked at me steadily. "But Cuke, a document filed at the registry, even a fraudulent one, creates a legal situation that requires a legal response. If we don't move quickly, the transfer process will begin, and stopping it after it has begun is significantly more complicated than stopping it before." "How quickly?" "The registry has a 30-day review period for inheritance submissions before processing begins. They filed this morning. We have 30 days from today, but practically speaking, the sooner we file a counter-document and a formal dispute, the better our position." 30 days. A number I could work with. I had spent my career thinking in terms of deadlines. In the quarterly cycles of cooperative accounting, where everything moved toward a date that did not negotiate. 30 days was not comfortable, but it was enough for someone who had been, in her own way, preparing for this moment for 15 years. The copy of the filed document arrived at 4 that afternoon, brought by a young man from the registry office who set it on the desk and left without meeting my eyes, which told me something about how the submission had been received internally, whether as routine paperwork or as something that had raised questions among the clerks who processed it. Hung spread it on the desk between us, and we read it together. It was professionally formatted. The language was correct, the structure followed the proper conventions, and the notarization stamp from the private office on Hung Vuong Street was clean and crisp, the kind of stamp produced by equipment that was well maintained and used frequently. Someone had prepared this carefully. The signature at the bottom, presented as Tron Thi Moi's final testament, was a reasonable approximation of an elderly woman's signature, slightly unsteady in the way age makes signatures unsteady, the pen pressure varying across the letters in a pattern that was meant to suggest frailty rather than demonstrate it. I had seen my mother-in-law sign her name thousands of times across 42 years. I knew the particular way she formed the T at the beginning, the way the final stroke of her family name curled slightly upward because she had learned to write in the old style before standardization, a habit she had never entirely lost. The signature on this document had the unsteadiness right but the habits wrong. The T was formed differently, the final curl absent. It was close. Close enough to pass a review by someone who had no basis for comparison, but not close enough to withstand examination by someone who did. This was signed by someone copying a signature they had seen, I said, not someone who had practiced it for years. Hung looked at where I was pointing. I took a piece of paper from the pad on his desk and wrote, from memory, the signature as it should have been, the way I had seen it on household registration, renewals and land tax receipts, and the old cooperative membership documents that Mother had kept in the wooden cabinet for 30 years. I set it beside the document. Hung studied them together for a long time. A handwriting analysis expert could establish this in court, he said quietly. But Cuck, there's something else here. He pointed to a clause near the bottom of the document, a section I had read but whose implications I was still working through. This clause. Do you see what it does? I looked at it again. The clause established that in the event the named heir was unable to be present to manage the transfer process due to work or other obligations, his household representative was authorized to act on his behalf in all matters relating to the estate, including but not limited to registration, transfer, and any subsequent disposition of the property. Household representative. The document did not use Hang's name anywhere in its body. It didn't need to. As the wife of the named heir, she was automatically his household representative under the relevant administrative regulations, a detail that someone with access to a notary office and familiarity with property transfer procedures would know precisely and use deliberately. This document, if it processed, would not give Loy the house. It would give Hang the authority to act for Loy in all estate matters. And Loy, working 3 provinces away on a contract that kept him occupied from before dawn until dark, trusted his wife to handle these things. He had said so himself. Hang says it's better to do these things early. I sat with that understanding, and let it complete itself in my mind the way a calculation completes itself when the last figure is entered, and the column finally adds to what it was always going to add to. This had never been about Loy inheriting. Loy was the mechanism, not the destination. Hang had spent 11 months since Mother's death constructing a document that would transfer administrative authority for this house and this land into her own hands, with her husband's name as cover and her brother's professional connections as the engine, and she had timed the filing to the period when I had been watching for it and therefore, she believed, could be managed. She did not know what was in Hung's office. She did not know that the document she had filed that morning to fill an absence was about to collide with something that had been waiting 15 years specifically for this collision. I gathered my coat and my bag and prepared to leave, and Hung walked me to the door, and I was already thinking about what came next when he said, quietly, behind me, "Cuke, the power of attorney that Koa filed. The one authorizing him to act as agent for the submission." I turned. "It was witnessed," he said. The witnessing signature on the power of attorney. He looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face before. the expression of a man who has uncovered something that goes beyond what he was expecting to find. It was signed by a justice of the peace, from the district court, someone with official standing. He paused. I know this man. He retired from the district court 4 years ago. Another pause, longer. He was in your mother-in-law's house the week before she died. I did not go home directly. I walked instead to the small tea shop, 2 streets from Hung's office, the one with the plastic stools and the overhead fan that never quite kept up with the afternoon heat, and I sat in the corner with a glass of tea. I did not drink, and I thought. The retired judge's name was Nguyen Sao Lam. I had not known him personally, but I knew of him, the way you know of people who occupy official positions in a district town, small enough that professional reputations travel without introduction. He had sat on the district court for 19 years. He had a reputation for correctness, for a certain rigidity of procedure that some people found frustrating, and others found reassuring, depending on which side of a proceeding they were on. He had retired 4 years ago, which was 2 years before Mother's health began its final decline, and in retirement he had, apparently, found other uses for his official standing. A retired justice of the peace could still witness documents, could still apply his seal to a power of attorney in a way that carried legal weight, could still provide the layer of official credibility that transformed a piece of paper drafted by a notary office with flexible standards into something that looked, to a registry clerk processing submissions, like an entirely legitimate instrument. What he had been doing in Mother's house the week before she died was something I needed to understand, and I needed to understand it without asking anyone who might tell Hang and Hua that I was asking. I finished the tea I hadn't meant to drink and went to find Ba Phuoc. She was in her garden when I arrived, which was where she spent most late afternoons, and she looked up at my face when I came through her gate and set down her trowel without being asked. The way she did when she recognized that something had happened and the garden could wait. I told her about the filed document, the forged will, the power of attorney, and Nguyen Sao Lam. I told her in the same plain accounting language I used for everything that needed to be understood accurately, without softening the figures or rounding them to something more comfortable. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I valued most about her. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the row of herbs along her back wall, and then she said, I saw him. I didn't know who he was then, but I saw him. The week before Mother died, Ba Phuoc had been watching the lane the way she always watched the lane, with the patient, comprehensive attention of a woman who has lived in the same house for 60 years and considers the street in front of it part of her natural territory. A car she didn't recognize had parked in front of my gate on a Tuesday afternoon. 2 men had gone inside. She described them, and the description of the shorter one, the one who had carried a document case, and walked with the particular deliberateness of someone accustomed to having his presence treated as significant, matched what I knew of Nguyen Sao Lam from the district court's old public records. They were inside for less than an hour, she said. Mother was very ill by then. She hadn't left her room in weeks. I thought about that hour. A woman in the final weeks of her life, in her room, too weak to come to the front of her own house. 2 men arriving with a document case. No family members present that Ba Phuoc had seen. No one who could testify afterward to what had or had not been said, what had or had not been signed, what an elderly woman in the last stages of her life might or might not have understood about what was being put in front of her. The construction of the forged will was becoming clearer in its layers. The document itself, prepared at Koa's notary office with its flexible standards. The signature, copied from something they had seen, imperfect in the details that only someone who knew Mother's handwriting would catch. And the power of attorney, witnessed by a retired judge who had visited the house when Mother was too ill to receive visitors in any meaningful sense, providing the official credibility that held the entire structure together. It was careful work. It was the work of people who understood legal procedures well enough to exploit their seams, who knew where the system relied on trust rather than verification, and had built their plan in precisely those spaces. But careful work leaves traces. I had spent 31 years finding traces in cooperative accounts, the small inconsistencies that appeared when someone had been careful but not careful enough, when the column looked correct until you checked it against the supporting receipts, and found that 2 figures that were supposed to match each other were separated by an amount too small to notice, unless you were looking specifically for the place where the adjustment had been made. Over the following week, I began collecting, quietly and systematically, everything that could be documented. From the registry office, through Hung's contact, I obtained a certified copy of the filed document and the accompanying power of attorney. I took them to my kitchen table in the evenings with my accounting notebook and worked through them section by section, noting every element that could be verified against external records, every claim that could be checked, every signature and seal and date that corresponded to something that had an independent existence somewhere in a file or a database or a memory. The date of the will presented its first concrete problem for them. The document claimed to record mother's wishes as expressed on a date 14 months before her death, when she had been living normally, receiving visitors, attending family events, but I had her medical records from that period, the quarterly checkups at the district clinic that I had accompanied her to for the last 3 years of her life, and on the date the will claimed to have been executed, she had been at the clinic for a blood pressure evaluation that had lasted most of the morning. She could not have signed a document at home on a morning when she was at the clinic. The clinic had records. The clinic had the registration slip in her file. I wrote it down. Date. Discrepancy. Source of verification. The same format I had used for 31 years when identifying errors in the cooperative's books. Bafwalk helped me reconstruct Hoa's visits to the house over the previous months, working from her own memory of the lane and the notes I had been keeping in my red notebook. We built a timeline of access, which visits had coincided with which dates connected to what submissions at which offices. The picture that emerged was of a campaign that had been running for at least 8 months, beginning well before the anniversary dinner, well before Hang had made her comment about old women and arithmetic, at a point when the death anniversary must have seemed to them like a useful occasion to establish, publicly, a narrative about an elderly woman who was too tired for complications. My grandmother used to say that a rice plant shows you nothing while it is growing. You watch the field day after day and nothing seems to change. And then one morning the grain is heavy and golden and everything has been happening underground the whole time you were watching the surface and seeing nothing. I had been watching the surface. Underground. The roots had been working for months. Hung filed our formal dispute with the registry office on the 12th day, 9 days before the document would have entered active processing. The dispute suspended the transfer pending investigation, which bought time but also announced to Hang and Hoa that the submission had been challenged. We could not avoid that. A dispute required notification to all parties. I was sitting at the kitchen table the afternoon. The notification would have reached them, doing the arithmetic of what they would do next, when my phone rang. Not Hang, not Koa, Loy. His voice was different this time, not careful, confused, with an edge of something underneath the confusion that I recognized as the sound of a man who has been told something that doesn't match what he thought he understood. Ma, he said, Hang says you've filed some kind of legal objection. About grandmother's house. She says you're trying to complicate the inheritance. A pause. She's very upset. I'm sure she is, I said. What's going on? Why would you do that without talking to me first? I looked at the kitchen wall, at the hook where Min's work jacket had hung for 30 years before I finally moved it to the wardrobe, at the window where the light was doing what it always did at this hour, and I decided how much to tell my son, and how much to let him find out in the way that would make it impossible to dismiss. Loy, I said, when you have a few days to come home, come home. There are things you need to see for yourself. He started to ask another question, but I had already heard, in the background of the call, Hang's voice saying something I couldn't make out, and then Loy's voice muffling as he turned away from the phone, and then, just before the muffling became complete, Hang's voice again, clearer this time, one phrase distinct before the sound cut off entirely. She was asking him whether I had found anything yet. Not whether I was causing problems. Not whether I was confused or upset or behaving in the way old women sometimes behaved when they felt left out of family decisions. Whether I had found anything. She already knew there was something to find. She just didn't know yet whether I had found it. Hang arrived at my house 4 days after Loy's phone call, and she did not knock. I heard the gate, then footsteps across the courtyard, then the front door opening the way it opens, when someone has decided they no longer need to observe the formality of announcing themselves at another person's threshold. I was in the kitchen. I stayed there. I poured a second cup of tea and set it on the tray and waited. She appeared in the kitchen doorway with Koa behind her, and she was wearing the expression I had last seen on her face at the anniversary dinner. The one that looked like warmth but was actually confidence, the confidence of someone who has decided the outcome and is now simply managing the remaining steps. She looked at the 2 cups on the tray without surprise, which told me she had expected me to hear them coming, which told me she had stopped caring whether I had warning or not. "We need to talk about the legal objection," she said, sitting down at my kitchen table, at the place where Min used to sit, without being invited to sit. Hoa remained standing near the doorway, which was a positioning choice that I noted, placing himself between me and the front of the house. "All right," I said. "You've created a problem for the family." Her voice was patient, the patience of someone explaining something to a person who is being unnecessarily difficult. Filing a dispute delays everything. It draws attention. It creates paperwork that costs money and time, and achieves nothing except making everyone uncomfortable. "I see. The will is legitimate." Mother made her wishes clear. Loy is the eldest son, and he should inherit. That's how things are done, you know that. She looked at me with something that was close to pity. "I understand this is hard. You've lived in this house a long time, but your position here doesn't change regardless of how the property is registered. You can still live here. Nothing has to change for you." She said the last part the way you say something to someone you believe is operating from fear rather than principle, offering reassurance to an old woman worried about her roof, her daily routine, the small continuities of a life lived in one place. She genuinely believed that was what I was protecting. The roof. The kitchen. The view of the longan tree from the back window. "How generous," I said. She studied me for a moment, and I saw something recalibrate behind her eyes. A brief adjustment, the way a person adjusts when the response they receive doesn't match the response they expected. Then she reached into the bag she had set on the table and removed a folder. "We've prepared some documents," she said, opening it. "A formal withdrawal of your objection, and a statement acknowledging the legitimacy of Mother's will and consenting to the transfer proceeding." She slid them across the table toward me. "If you sign these today, we can have the dispute cleared within the week. Everything moves forward. No one has to go to court. The family doesn't have to spend money on lawyers." I looked at the documents without touching them. They were professionally prepared, the language careful and complete, the spaces for my signature clearly marked with small pencil crosses. Someone had put time into these. Someone who understood the relevant legal forms. "Koa prepared these?" I asked. "We had professional help," Hang said, which was not an answer, and was meant to be not an answer. "The important thing is that they're correct, and they resolve the situation." I looked up at her. "I'll need time to read them carefully." "Of course." The patience again. "But not too much time. The registry has timelines." She paused. "And mother-in-law, I want to be honest with you. If this goes to a formal legal dispute, it becomes public. The neighbors, the relatives, everyone will know there's a family conflict over an inheritance. That's not comfortable for anyone. It's especially not comfortable for an older woman living alone." Another pause. This one carrying slightly more weight than the last. "People will wonder why she's making things difficult for her own son." There it was, the thing underneath the patience, the actual instrument being used now, that the first approach had not produced the expected result. Not threat exactly. Framing. The establishment of a narrative that would run ahead of whatever I did next, coloring how the district and the relatives and the registry clerks would interpret my resistance. A difficult old woman, a mother-in-law who had always been territorial about the family home. Someone whose grief had perhaps made her confused about what was hers and what wasn't. I had seen this instrument used in the cooperative, in the years when a department head wanted to dismiss an accountant's findings before they reached the management committee. You didn't argue with the numbers. You questioned the person who had produced them. "I understand," I said. Hang closed her folder. She left the documents on the table. "Take a few days," she said, standing. "But Kyuk, I mean this kindly. This is a situation where the sensible choice is the easy one. Don't make things harder than they need to be." She said it the way someone says something they intend as the final word, the way a door sounds when it is closed on a finished conversation. Then she walked out of my kitchen, through my front room, past my altar where the incense had burned down to gray stubs, and out through my front door, with her brother behind her, and I heard the gate close after them and listened to the sound of Koa's car starting in the lane. I sat at my kitchen table with their documents in front of me and my cooling tea beside them, and I did not move for a while. The afternoon had gone flat and gray outside, the particular flatness of the sky before rain that makes everything look like it is waiting, the light even and directionless and without shadows. Through the back window I could see the longan tree standing in the courtyard the way it always stood, old and steady and indifferent to the particular concerns of any afternoon. I thought about Hang's offer, not because I was considering it, but because thinking through an offer carefully was the only way to understand what it revealed about the person making it. She had come with withdrawal documents already prepared, which meant she had expected this meeting and expected it to end with my signature. She had brought Koa, which meant she had wanted a witness, either to my compliance or to my refusal. She had used the word kindly twice, which meant she was aware the conversation had edges and wanted them attributed to circumstances rather than intention. And she had told me, without meaning to, what she most needed from this meeting. Not my cooperation, exactly. My documentation. A signed withdrawal, in my handwriting, with my name on it, entered into the registry record as evidence that I had voluntarily relinquished any challenge to the submitted will. Once that document existed, what I knew, what I had gathered, what Hung had prepared, would all have to contend with a record showing that I myself had certified the will as legitimate. She was not making me an offer. She was trying to get me to sign the keystone out of my own case. My phone showed a message from Hung sent an hour earlier. He had received a response from the registry to our dispute filing. The investigation they were required to conduct before processing could resume had been formally initiated. The name of the investigator assigned was attached. I looked at the name. I read it twice to be certain. The investigator assigned to examine our dispute and determine whether to proceed with the challenge transfer was a civil servant from the district administrative office named Fan Van Duke, who had retired from that office 3 years ago and then been reinstated on a contract basis 18 months ago, and whose contract renewal, according to the public administrative record that Hung had attached, had been approved by a committee that included, as one of its reviewing members, Nguyen Sao Lam. The same Nguyen Sao Lam who had been in Mother's house the week before she died, carrying a document case. The investigator assigned to examine the legitimacy of a forged will was connected to the man who had helped forge it, and Hang and Koa had known this when the dispute was filed, had perhaps arranged for it to be so, and had come to my kitchen this afternoon, not because they were worried about the outcome of the investigation, but because they wanted to close the matter before the investigation's conclusion gave anyone outside their circle opportunity to look at it too carefully. I set down my phone. I looked at the withdrawal documents on my kitchen table, at the pencil crosses marking where my name was supposed to go. Then I looked at my front door, at the empty space where they had stood in my house as though they already owned it. I understood, completely, that if I did not find a way through what was in front of me, the machinery they had built would process to its conclusion with the same indifferent efficiency as a cooperative accounting period that had already been closed, and the only thing that would stop it was something that could not be questioned, could not be reframed, could not be managed by an investigator whose supervisor was connected to the men who had filed the original document. I needed something that existed outside their system entirely, something that had been waiting in a place they had never thought to look. Tomorrow morning, I would call Hung and tell him it was time. Hung's office in the morning felt different than it had before. The way a familiar room feels different when you enter it, knowing that what happens inside it today will determine what comes after. The same wooden shelves, the same smell of old paper, the same single window with its low morning light. But the folder he placed on the desk between us was one I had not seen before, thicker than the copies of the filed documents, its edges worn in the way of something that had been handled carefully for a long time. "I want to show you something before we discuss the next steps," he said. "Something Mother asked me to keep together with the will, in the same file. I have been waiting for the right moment to share it, and I believe that moment is now." He opened the folder. The will itself was on top, the document I knew existed, the one Mother had made 15 years ago in this same office with Hung as her witness, properly notarized, legally complete, its language clear and unambiguous in the way that Hung's language always was, because he had learned long ago that ambiguity in documents of this kind was a cruelty to the people who would eventually depend on them. But beneath the will was something I had not known was there. A letter. Handwritten, in Mother's script. The real script, the one I knew from 42 years of reading her handwriting on shopping lists and festival greetings, and the small notes she left on the kitchen table when she rose before me, dated 8 months before her death. The ink was slightly faded in the way that ink fades when paper is kept in a dry place over time, but the characters were firm, written in the deliberate, careful hand of a woman who had understood what she was writing and wanted it understood correctly. Hung said, quietly, "She asked me to read it to you." Those were her instructions. She said you should hear it in her voice, not read it with your own. I looked at him across the desk for a moment, then I nodded. He read. She had written to me the way she had always spoken to me, directly, without preamble, the way of a woman who had lived long enough to know that the space between people who trust each other does not require elaborate approach. She said that she had watched Hang for 11 years before she wrote the letter, which meant she had started watching from the first year of the marriage, the year I had also started watching without knowing that Mother was watching alongside me. Both of us silent about it, both of us keeping our own ledger of the same account. She wrote about specific things she had seen. Not impressions, not feelings, but events with dates attached to them, the particular precision of a woman who had kept household accounts for 60 years and understood the difference between what you feel and what you can document. The year Hang had redirected a portion of the Lunar New Year money that relatives had given to Loy, telling him it had been spent on household necessities, while Mother, watching from the back room, had seen her set aside a separate amount in a red envelope that went into her own bag rather than the household box. The year she had told Loy that Mother had asked for fewer visits because she was tired, when in fact Mother had asked for nothing of the sort and had spent those weeks waiting for her son to come home and not understanding why he didn't. The quiet, systematic way she had begun referring to the house and the land as Loy's inheritance, not in contexts of planning or care but in contexts of calculation, in conversations with her brother, when she believed no one who mattered was listening. Hung read steadily, his voice careful and even, and I sat across from him and I listened, and I kept my hands flat on my thighs, the way I did when I needed to remain still, and the morning light moved very slowly across the desk between us. Then he reached the part of the letter that changed everything. Mother wrote that 2 years before her death, she had received a visit from Koa, alone, on a morning when she was already unwell but still receiving people. She described him as pleasant, which was the word she used, and she described the conversation as beginning with pleasantries about the family and the neighborhood and her health before arriving at its actual subject, which he had introduced gradually, the way you introduce a heavy object by approaching it from the side rather than attempting to lift it directly. He had asked her whether she had made arrangements for the house. He had framed it as concern, as a question any responsible family member might ask an aging relative. But he had then, with the same gradual careful movement, begun to describe what those arrangements might look like. What documents would be sensible to prepare, how a will made through his office's services would ensure that everything was simple and clear for the family. He had mentioned Loy, and Loy's position as eldest son, and the naturalness of eldest sons inheriting family property, and how much easier this would make things for everyone, and Mother had listened and nodded and given nothing away, because Mother had understood exactly what was being said underneath what was being said, and she had made her decision about it in the moment, and had never told him what that decision was. She wrote that she had called Hung the following morning, and made a second copy of the will, updated to include a specific clause protecting the land beside the irrigation canal from any sale or subdivision, regardless of who inherited the house, because she had understood from Koa's visit that the land's value to them was not sentimental. Hung paused in his reading. He turned the page. The last section of the letter was addressed to me by name, which was the first time in the reading that she had done so, and hearing my name in his voice, reading her words in that small office in the morning light, was the thing that finally broke the stillness I had been maintaining. She wrote, "Cook, You have been a daughter to me in every way that matters, and I have not always said that with enough plainness, because I am not a woman who finds such things easy to say. You stayed when staying was not comfortable. You tended what needed tending. You kept faith with this house, and with the people in it when it would have been simpler not to. She wrote, I know what hang is. I have known for a long time. I also know that Loy cannot see it, because some things about the people we love are invisible to us until they are no longer invisible, and the becoming visible is its own kind of loss, and I do not want to make that loss happen prematurely for my son. But I want you to be protected, and I want the house to be protected, and I want what my husband's father built and what my husband kept and what you and I have tended together to go to the right purpose when I am gone. She wrote, I am sorry I did not say more of this while I could still say it to your face. Some things are easier to write at the end than to speak in the middle. Hung stopped reading. The office was very quiet. Somewhere outside a motorbike passed in the street, the sound of it coming and going in the ordinary way of ordinary mornings, and the incense smell that I associated with Mother's altar drifted through my memory with a sharpness that had nothing to do with the room I was sitting in. I had known, for many years, that Mother saw me clearly. I had felt it in the nod she had given my accounting textbooks on my first evening in the house, in the way she had sat beside me at Min's funeral without offering words that would not have helped, in the Tuesday afternoon 15 years ago and the gardenia smell and her clear deliberate instructions. I had known she trusted me. I had not known she had written it down. I had not known that she had watched Koa come to her house and understood his purpose and called Hung the next morning and added a clause to her will with the specific practical intelligence of a woman protecting what she loved with the tools available to her. I had not known she had documented 2 years of Hang's behavior in her own hand before she became too ill to write easily, with dates and specifics, and the careful accounting precision of someone who had spent her life distinguishing between what you felt and what you could prove. And I had not known, until I sat in that office with the morning light on the desk between us, that what I had believed for 15 years was a secret I was keeping for her was also a gift she had been preparing for me, assembling over years, adding to, updating, kept current with the same care I had given the altar every morning since Min died. The folder held more than the will and the letter. Hung showed me the rest of it. The updated clause protecting the canal land. The notation he had made on the day Mother called him after Koa's visit, dated and signed, admissible as a contemporaneous record. The clinic records from the date the forged will claim to have been executed, which Hung had requested when he first saw the filed document and which showed Mother in a medical appointment that morning, a fact the forged will's creators could not have known to account for because they had not been careful about that particular detail. Evidence. Not one piece of it, but a structure of it, built layer by layer over years by 2 women who had never explicitly discussed what they were building because they had not needed to. I looked at everything on the desk for a long moment. Then I looked at Hung and said, in a voice that was steadier than I expected it to be, tell me how we use all of this. I left Hung's office that morning with a copy of everything in a plain cloth bag that looked like the kind of bag an old woman carries to the market. That was intentional. I had brought it specifically because it looked like nothing, because nothing I was carrying should suggest to anyone watching that I was carrying anything that mattered. No one was watching. But I had learned, in the weeks since the anniversary dinner, to behave as though someone might be, the same way a careful accountant enters figures as though the books might be audited, not because they expect the audit but because the habit of accuracy does not distinguish between observed and unobserved moments. At home, I put the bag in the back of the wardrobe where Min's work jacket hung, behind the folded winter blankets that no one had reason to move until the cold season. Then I made tea and sat at the kitchen table with my red notebook and began to plan. In the same methodical way I had planned everything that required precision, working from the evidence outward to the sequence of steps that would bring it to the right place at the right time in front of the right people. What we had was strong. I understood that now with a clarity I had not allowed myself before Hung read the letter, because before the letter I had known the shape of what existed without knowing its full weight. Now I knew the weight, and the weight was considerable. The real will, properly notarized, predating the forged one by 15 years. The letter in Mother's hand, documenting Koa's visit and her response to it, with Hung's contemporaneous notation establishing the timeline. The clinic records showing mother in a medical appointment on the morning the forged will claim she was at home signing documents. The handwriting discrepancy in the forged signature, demonstrable by anyone who had seen mother's real signature on the documents that still existed in the household registration files and the old cooperative records. Each piece was useful. Together, they were something more than useful. They were the kind of complete account that left no reasonable alternative explanation, the kind that a district court judge, reviewing the evidence from both sides, would have difficulty dismissing without dismissing their own professional judgment. But evidence was only as effective as its presentation, and presentation required strategy, and strategy required understanding, not just what you had, but where it would land with the most force and the least opportunity for counter-maneuver. I wrote 3 columns in my notebook. What we had. Where it needed to go. In what order? The order mattered most. If we moved first through the registry dispute, the formal investigation channel, we risked the Van Van Dyck problem. The assigned investigator whose connection to Nguyen Sao Lam gave Hang and Hoa a mechanism to slow, complicate, or redirect the finding. The investigation was a door we controlled, but it was a door they had a key to, and using it first would tell them we were moving before we had secured the position that made our movement impossible to stop. What we needed was to remove the investigator problem before using the registry channel. And the way to remove it was not to challenge Van Van Dyck directly, which would take months, and draw attention to exactly the aspect of the situation that was most complicated to explain to relatives and neighbors who knew nothing of the procedural specifics, but to make his involvement irrelevant by bringing the case to a level above his jurisdiction before the investigation produced a finding. Hung had a contact at the Provincial Justice Department, a senior official who had worked with him on a land rights case 3 years earlier and who had a reputation for the kind of professional seriousness that found the Van Van Dyck situation genuinely objectionable when it was presented, plainly, with documentation, in writing, through proper channels. A formal complaint filed at the provincial level, citing the conflict of interest in the investigator assignment and attaching the evidence of the forged documents' internal inconsistencies, would trigger a provincial review that superseded the district investigation, removing the compromised investigator from the process entirely. That was the first move. Quiet. Administrative. Nothing visible from the outside. The second move was Loy. I had been thinking about Loy throughout all of this. In the way you think about a necessary and painful conversation that cannot be avoided indefinitely. Turning it over, looking for the approach that was honest without being destructive, clear without being weaponized. He had been a mechanism in Hang's plan, but he had been an unwilling one. A man whose trust had been used against him, and there was a difference between that and culpability that I intended to respect. But he needed to know, and he needed to know from me, with the documents in front of him, before he heard a version of events from Hang that had been constructed to position me as the source of the family's difficulty. The sequence here was critical. Loy had to see the evidence before Hung knew we had the letter. Once Hung knew we had the letter, she would begin managing Loy's understanding of it. And Loy, who trusted his wife more than he trusted his own perception of events he had not witnessed, would be susceptible to that management in ways that could complicate his response. I wrote him a message that evening that said only, "I need you to come home before the end of the month. There are things your grandmother wanted you to know that I should have told you sooner. It is not urgent in the sense of danger, but it is important in the way that some things are important that do not announce themselves as emergencies." He called within the hour, the way Loy always called when a message from me had a tone that concerned him, the reflexive attentiveness of a son who had been raised to pay attention to what his mother said, rather than only to what she said it about. I told him the same thing I had said in the message. I told him gently, and I told him the minimum necessary to ensure he would come, and I did not tell him what he would find when he arrived, because that needed to be shown rather than described. He said he would come in 10 days. I said that was good. After I ended the call, I sat in the front room with the altar candles lit, the small flames steady in the still air, the photographs of the dead watching the room in their permanent calm way, and I thought about the 10 days. In 10 days, the provincial complaint would have been filed and acknowledged. In 10 days, Hung would have submitted a formal request to the registry to stay the investigation pending the provincial review, which was a procedural right that the registry was obligated to respect once a provincial complaint was on record. In 10 days, the case would have been moved to ground that Hang and Hoa had not prepared for, because they had prepared for a district proceeding with an investigator they had reason to trust, and what was coming was not that. I also, in those 10 days, finished something I had started the morning after the anniversary dinner but had not had occasion to complete. I went through the cooperative's old archived records, the ones I had kept my own copies of when I retired, the quarterly reports and the annual summaries from 31 years of accounting work, and I found the years when I had documented discrepancies and traced them and resolved them, and the accounts had balanced because I had been patient and systematic and had not moved until I had everything I needed. There was a particular satisfaction in that kind of work that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with correctness, the satisfaction of a figure that had been wrong being made right, of a column that had resisted balancing, finally yielding to the right combination of entries. I had felt it hundreds of times across 31 years. I recognized it now, as it began to build in the weeks of preparation, the accumulating certainty of work done correctly moving toward its proper conclusion. On the 9th day, Hung filed the provincial complaint. On the 10th day, Loy's bus arrived at the district station at 2:30 in the afternoon, and I was there to meet him, and I looked at my son's face when he came through the station gate, tired from the journey, older than I sometimes remembered him when I thought of him from a distance, and I understood that what I was about to show him would change things between him and his wife in ways that could not be undone. I had not wanted this for him. I wanted to be clear about that, even here, even in my own accounting of events. I had not wanted this. But wanting and necessity were two different columns, and they did not always balance. I put my hand on his arm and walked him to where my neighbor's son had parked the borrowed car, and I told him we were going to a lawyer's office before we went home, and something in the way I said it made him stop asking questions and simply walk beside me in the afternoon light, and I thought about the days ahead, about the second death anniversary that was coming in 1 month, about the room full of relatives and the altar and the incense and the folder that Hung would carry in from the car at exactly the right moment. The water had been still for a very long time. Tomorrow it would begin to move. The second death anniversary of Tran Thi Moi fell on a Sunday, and the house filled the way it always filled for these occasions, relatives arriving from the lane and the next lane over, and the district town and the province beyond, bringing fruit and incense, and the particular subdued sociability of people, gathered to remember someone they had loved or respected or simply known for a long time. I had cooked since 5 in the morning. The same dishes as the year before, the sticky rice, the braised pork, the bitter melon soup. I had set the altar with fresh flowers and 3 new incense sticks and Mother's photograph, which I had reframed over the winter in dark lacquered wood that suited her better than the gilt frame Hang had chosen for it at the first anniversary. No one had commented on the change. No one asked about the things I did quietly and without announcement. Hang arrived at 10 with Hoa behind her, the same configuration as always, and she moved through the arriving relatives with the same ease she always moved through rooms full of people, warm and organized, and apparently genuinely pleased to be present. The performance so consistent across years that I understood it was no longer entirely a performance, but had become a second nature, the way any habit becomes a nature if you practice it long enough without examining it. She embraced cousins, directed the placement of the food offerings, suggested to an aunt where she might find a chair more comfortable than the one she had chosen. She was, by every visible measure, a competent and attentive daughter-in-law at a family gathering, and anyone arriving without prior knowledge of the past year would have seen exactly that. Loy sat near the altar. He had been quiet since the day I took him to Hung's office, the particular quietness of a man who has received information that reorganized his understanding of his own life and is still in the process of integrating it. He had not confronted Hang. I had asked him not to, and he had agreed, with the seriousness of a man who trusted that I had a reason for the request even if I had not explained the full reason, which was that I needed Hang to walk into this room today without any warning of what was prepared, because warning would have produced a counter-response, and a counter-response would have produced a more complicated afternoon than what I had planned. He knew what was coming. He had agreed to it. That was enough. Hung arrived at 10:30, dressed in the plain, dark clothing appropriate to the occasion, introduced to the relatives nearest the door as an old family friend, which was the kind of truth that did not require elaboration. He carried a document folder under his arm. He greeted people with the quiet politeness of a man attending a solemn occasion and took a seat near the window, out of the natural center of attention. Bafwak was already there, arrived early as she always did, seated near the kitchen with the permanent cup of tea that seemed to find its way into her hands at every gathering in my house. She and I had not needed to speak much in the days leading up to this. She knew the outline. She would be present as she was always present, and that was all that was required of her. The prayers happened at 11, the family gathering before the altar, the incense lit and passed from hand to hand, Loy standing at the front with his hands folded, and his face arranged in an expression I could not entirely read from where I stood, something between grief and determination that looked, in the incense smoke and the low morning light, very much like his father's face at difficult moments. Hang stood beside him. She glanced at me once across the room during the prayers, the quick assessing glance she had developed over the past months, checking the temperature of my cooperation, and I met it with the same half-smile I had offered at the first anniversary, and she looked away. When the prayers finished and the family settled into the meal, I waited until the first course had been eaten, until the conversation had found its rhythm, and the room had relaxed into the ordinary noise of a family gathering, and then I stood. Not loudly, not with the announcement of someone demanding attention. I simply stood, the way a person stands when they have something to say, and have decided it is time to say it. And the room noticed in the gradual way rooms notice these things, table by table, conversation by conversation, until the noise had settled and the faces had turned toward me. I want to share something, I said, that my mother-in-law left for this family. Something she prepared herself, in her own hand, that she asked to be shared when the time was right. Hang's expression did not change immediately. She was too practiced for that. But I saw the stillness that came over her, the particular stillness of a person who has heard something that requires them to rapidly assess what it means and what their response to it should be. Hung stood and brought the folder to the table. He opened it without theater, without ceremony, the way a person opens a folder that contains factual information and allows the information to do what it will do without assistance from drama. He placed the will on the table first. "This is the last will and testament of Tron Thi Moi," I said, prepared 15 years ago at the office of lawyer Bui the Hung, properly notarized and legally complete. It has been held at his office since the day of its execution, known only to the two of them, and to me. I heard a cousin near the window draw breath. An aunt set down her chopsticks. The document submitted to the District Land Registry 3 months ago under my mother-in-law's name is not this document. It was prepared elsewhere, signed with a signature that is not hers, and submitted by an agent who had no legal authority to act in this matter, because the will that grants any authority in this matter is this one, which was already in existence, and which supersedes any later document under the relevant provisions of inheritance law. Hang found her voice. "This is not the time or place for—" My mother-in-law chose this time and place. I kept my voice even. She left instructions. I am following them. Hung placed the letter on the table beside the will. She also left this. A letter, written in her own hand 8 months before her death, addressed to this family. It documents her observations over many years. It records a visit she received from a family member who suggested she prepare a will through a private notary office. It records her decision, made after that visit, to update the will she had already made to include additional protections for the family land. The room had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that contains many people, each making rapid internal calculations about what they are hearing and what it means for their understanding of the past year. I looked at Hang. "Last year at this table," I said, "you told this family that a woman who spent her career doing the cooperative's accounting couldn't have left behind anything worth very much, that calculating things at my age only exhausted the mind, that the younger generation should handle the difficult things." She met my eyes. Her face was composed, but beneath the composition something had shifted, the first visible movement of something that had been held very still for a very long time. "My mother-in-law was 73 when she wrote this letter," I said. "She was 81 when she died." She spent the last years of her life watching her household carefully, documenting what she saw with the same precision she had applied to everything in her life. And she made decisions about the future of this house that no one in this room, including the people who tried to substitute their own documents for hers, could anticipate or prevent. I placed my hand on the letter. She was an old woman at the end of her life. She could not always leave her room. She received few visitors and asked for little. And in those conditions, with those limitations, she outmaneuvered everyone who had decided her age made her a manageable problem. I looked at the room, at the relatives who had come to remember her, at Loy's face beside the altar, at Bafwak's steady presence near the kitchen door. She did that, I said, because she had spent 83 years learning the difference between the things that could be taken from a person and the things that could not. She knew that what she had built with her husband and tended with her hands was not simply property. It was a record of a life lived with integrity, and she intended it to be passed on with integrity, to the right people, for the right reasons, and she made certain, in the quiet and careful way she made everything certain, that it would be. I sat down. The folder remained open on the table, the will and the letter side by side, the real documents beside the documented evidence of their falsification, the clinic records and Hung's contemporaneous notation, and the handwriting comparison that Hung now placed beside them one by one, building the account the way accounts were meant to be built, entry by entry, until the column was complete. And the figure at the bottom was the only figure it could be. Koa's chair scraped against the floor. He was on his feet, and his face had the color of a man who has understood, in the space of the last 10 minutes, the full extent of what he had misjudged, and the extent was considerable, and it was written on him plainly enough that every person in the room could see it without needing to be told what they were seeing. Koa stood for perhaps 3 seconds before he sat back down. And in those 3 seconds the room watched him with the particular attention of people who have just understood that the person they are looking at has been, until this moment, something other than what he appeared to be. He sat because there was nothing else to do. Standing had been instinct, the reflexive movement of a person whose plan has encountered an obstacle and whose body has responded before the mind has finished calculating what the obstacle means. Sitting was the calculation completing itself. There was no direction to move toward. There was no action available to him in this room, at this table, with these documents open in front of 40 people, that would improve his position. Hang did not stand. She remained exactly where she had been throughout, upright, hands on the table, her face still composed in its external structure, even as something behind the composure was doing rapid work that her expression was not designed to conceal under this particular pressure. I had seen her manage rooms before. I had seen her manage conversations that threatened to go in directions she didn't want. I had never seen her manage something she had not had time to prepare a management strategy for, and the small, visible evidence of that newness was in her eyes, which were moving, calculating, assessing the room for the thing that rooms sometimes offered in difficult situations, the person who was uncertain, the relative who was confused, the angle of approach that might yet allow a partial recovery. She found nothing useful. The room was clear. It was an uncle near the door who spoke first, one of Mother's nephews from the province, a man who had come to both anniversaries and who had known Mother since his own childhood, who said, in the plain, direct way of someone who has processed information and arrived at a conclusion and sees no reason to soften the conclusion for the sake of comfort. The document you filed. You knew it wasn't real. He was looking at Koa. Koa looked at the table. The uncle looked at Hang. Did you know? Hang opened her mouth. What came out was not what she had intended. I could tell from the slight delay before it came. The delay of a person who has prepared several responses and is choosing between them in real time, and choosing poorly because the real time is too compressed for the choosing to be done well. The document was prepared in good faith based on what we understood Mother's wishes to be. Based on what? Bafwak said from near the kitchen door, her voice carrying the particular weight of a woman who has been sitting quietly for 2 hours and has decided it is time to stop sitting quietly. She never told you her wishes. She told no one. That's the whole point of what you just heard. We believed. You believed there was no will, Bafwak said. So you made one. That's not a belief. That's a decision. Hang looked at her husband. This was the moment I had been watching for, without knowing I was watching for it. The moment when the weight of what was in the room exceeded what could be managed by a single person, when the instinct that had held the two of them in alignment across months of planning was tested by the pressure of 40 witnesses and a provincial justice complaint and a real will that had been waiting 15 years for exactly this occasion, and the alignment cracked along the line where it had always been weakest, which was the line between Hang and Koa, between the person who needed and the person who enabled, between the ambition and the mechanism that served it. Koa said, "I told you the timing was wrong." It was quiet. It was almost nothing. Said to the table, not to the room, said in the private register of a conversation that was not meant to include 40 people and included them anyway because the room was silent and the words were audible, and the human instinct to hear something said in confidence is stronger than the instinct of the person saying it to remember. They are not alone. Hang turned her head toward him with the slow precision of a person who cannot believe what they have just heard and needs the evidence of looking directly at the source before they can process it. "I told you," he said again, still to the table, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who has arrived at the far side of something and found it smaller than he expected, "that we should verify first. That we should make sure there was nothing already on file before we submitted anything. You said there was no time." Hua. Her voice was low and very controlled, the control of a woman applying maximum pressure through minimum visible effort, the same control she applied to everything, and it had always worked on him before. I could see from the way the word landed that it had always worked, that he had always pulled back when she used that particular tone, that the dynamic between them across their whole lives had been this, her certainty and his compliance, and the space between those two things where plans got made. It did not work now. Perhaps because the room was watching. Perhaps because the provincial complaint had already been filed and he understood, in a way she had not yet fully accepted, that the situation had moved past the point where her management of him changed the outcome in any meaningful way. Perhaps simply because a person can comply indefinitely until the moment when compliance and self-preservation are no longer the same direction, and that moment had arrived for Hoa at this table in front of this room. "The notary stamp," he said. "I used the office stamp without authorization from the senior partner. If this goes to the provincial level, which it already has according to the complaint registered last week, the senior partner will be required to account for how his stamp appeared on a document he didn't process. He will say he didn't process it, and then the question becomes, who used his stamp without his knowledge?" He was not looking at Hang. He was not looking at anyone. He was looking at the middle distance between himself and the documents on the table. And the expression on his face was one I recognized from the cooperative, from the years when I had identified an accounting error serious enough that the person responsible had understood that the column was going to balance against them no matter what they did next, the expression of a man calculating not how to prevent the outcome, but how to manage his position within it. Loy had not spoken during any of this. He sat beside the altar and he watched his wife's face, and he did not speak, and the watching was the most significant thing in the room, more significant than Hoa's words or Hang's controlled silence, or the provincial complaint or the documents on the table, because it was the watching of a man who loves someone and is seeing them clearly for the first time and is in the process of understanding that those two things, the love and the clarity, are going to have to find a new relationship to each other now that they can no longer pretend the clarity doesn't exist. Hang looked at her husband across the table. Then she looked at me. What was in her expression in that moment was not the composure she had maintained across the afternoon, and it was not the coldness I had seen underneath the composure on the few occasions when the composure had slipped, and it was not the performance of warmth she had used in this house and in front of this family for 11 years. It was something simpler and less constructed than any of those things. It was the expression of a person who has built something with great care and great confidence and has watched it come apart in a room full of witnesses and knows, with the certainty that only direct experience provides, that it is not going to be put back together. I did not say anything to her. There was nothing to say that the room had not already said more clearly than I could have said it. Hung gathered the documents from the table with the quiet efficiency of a man who has done what he came to do and is now allowing events to proceed without his direction, because they no longer required direction. He would file the full evidentiary package with the Provincial Justice Department the following morning. the district registry investigation would be suspended pending the provincial review, the forged will and the power of attorney, and the notary stamp used without authorization, and the retired judge who had witnessed documents in a dying woman's home would all enter a formal record that would take months to fully process, but whose direction was no longer in question. An aunt began to cry, not dramatically, the small private tears of someone who knew Mother and was thinking about what Mother had lived through in her last years, what she had seen and documented and carried without burdening anyone with it. Bafwak refilled her tea. The longan tree in the courtyard moved in the late morning breeze, its old branches slow and unhurried, indifferent to the afternoon the way it was indifferent to all afternoons, having been present for more of them than anyone in the room could account for. I looked at the altar, at Mother's photograph in its dark lacquered frame, at the 3 incense sticks I had lit that morning still producing their thin steady smoke, patient and continuous, the way tended things are patient when they have been properly tended. I thought she would have found the afternoon satisfying. Not in a triumphant way. In the way of a woman who had planned something carefully and seen it work exactly as planned. In the way of a woman who had always known that the numbers, given enough time and honesty, would balance. The provincial review took 4 months, which was faster than Hung had expected and slower than I would have preferred, but I had spent enough years working within institutional timelines to understand that the pace of official processes was not a judgment on the urgency of the matter being processed, only a reflection of the volume of matters being processed alongside it. I did not spend those 4 months waiting, I spent them living, which is what you do when you have finished the part that required all of your concentrated attention and the remaining part is in the hands of people and institutions doing their work at their own pace. I tended the garden. I walked to the market on Tuesdays and Fridays. I argued with the fish seller about mackerel prices, which had not improved despite my years of sustained objection. I had Bafwok over for tea on Thursday afternoons, and we talked about her grandchildren, and my pension adjustment, and the new family that had moved into the house, 2 lanes over, and whether they seemed like people who would maintain the drainage channel properly, which was an issue of significant concern to both of us. Loy came home twice during those 4 months, for longer than he had come home in years, the extended visits of a man rearranging his understanding of his own life, and finding it necessary to do that rearrangement in a place that felt solid. We did not talk about Hang directly very often. We talked around her, the way you talk around the place where something was when the something is no longer there, and gradually we talked around it less, and about other things more, about his father, and about the early years, and about the longan tree, and whether it would produce better this season if he pruned the lower branches, which was the kind of conversation that would have seemed trivial a year ago and felt, now, like exactly the right kind. He did most of the pruning himself, over a weekend in the 3rd month, standing in the courtyard with his father's old pruning saw, working with the careful, methodical attention of a man who does physical things well, and finds in them a relief from things that cannot be approached with tools. I watched from the kitchen doorway, and thought about Min, who had done the same thing for 30 years, with the same saw, with the same careful attention, and I thought about how the things that persist in a family are rarely the things anyone plans to preserve. The provincial review concluded on a Thursday in late autumn. Hung called me in the morning with the formal outcome, which he read from the official letter in the same careful, economical way he read everything, giving me the precise language, without embellishment, because he understood I preferred precision to interpretation. The forged will was declared invalid in its entirety. The power of attorney filed alongside it was declared fraudulent, the notary stamp having been confirmed as used without authorization by the senior partner of the office on Hung Vuong Street. The registry submission was struck from the record. Nguyen Sao Lam, the retired judge who had witnessed documents in Mother's home during the final weeks of her life, was referred to the Provincial Bar Association for review of his conduct, a process with its own timeline that I would likely never see fully resolved, but that existed now in an official record where it would follow him through whatever remained of his professional standing. Hoa faced separate referral to the Notary Association and potential civil liability for the unauthorized use of the office stamp. What happened to him after that was, as Hung said, a matter for other proceedings, and he said it in a tone that suggested he found those proceedings adequately consequential without our needing to monitor them directly. Hang was not prosecuted, In the end, though she was named in the provincial finding as having participated in the submission of a fraudulent document, the distinction between named and prosecuted was a legal one that I did not spend energy resenting. What the finding established was a permanent official record, accessible to anyone who looked, of what had been attempted and what had been found. That was, for my purposes, sufficient. The real will was processed through the registry in the correct manner, with the proper documentation and the proper witnesses, in the 3rd week of November. Mother's wishes, as she had recorded them 15 years earlier, were given legal effect in a session at Hung's office that took 40 minutes, and that I attended with Loy and with Ba Phuoc, as the witness she had originally named in the document. The house passed to Loy, with the clause protecting the canal land intact, as Mother had wanted. The altar and the courtyard, and the longan tree, and the back garden, and the small raised mounds of the family graves, in their quiet corner, remained what they had always been, continuous with everything that had come before them, answerable to the family that had maintained them, rather than the market that had assessed their value. I did not become richer through any of this. The house was Loy's, not mine, and my position in it was what it had always been. The position of a woman who had come into this family as a young wife and had stayed as the family changed around her, through children and loss and marriage and more loss, and who had tended what needed tending, because that was what you did with the things that deserved tending. Nothing was added to what I had. What was restored was simply the right shape of what already existed. The columns returned to their correct figures, the accounts reflecting what was true rather than what someone had tried to substitute for the truth. This was not nothing. I want to say that plainly, because it might seem like nothing from the outside, like a woman who spent a year of her life fighting to end up exactly where she had started. But there is a difference between a truth that has been tested and found to hold and a truth that has simply never been challenged. And the difference is not visible from the outside, but it is felt on the inside, in the way a structure feels different once you know its foundations have been examined and confirmed. Once you have stood in the room while someone tried to bring it down and watched it remain standing. The morning after the registry processed the will, I rose before dawn and lit the incense at the altar. 3 sticks. The smoke rose in its thin, steady threads past Mother's photograph and past Min's and past his parents, all of them watching the room with their permanent calm. And I stood in the quiet of the house while the birds began outside, and the morning came slowly through the courtyard window, and I thought about the 15 years I had carried what Mother had given me to carry, the Tuesday afternoon and the gardenia smell, and her clear, deliberate voice. And I thought about the way tended things hold. She had trusted me with something she could not protect herself in the end, could not carry to its conclusion because her body had reached the limit of what it could carry, and she had given it to me instead. And I had tended it the way I tended everything she had taught me to tend, with patience and without announcement, knowing that the right moment would come, and that the work was to be ready when it did. I understood, standing at that altar, that the inheritance she had left me was not in the will was Loy's. The inheritance she had left me was the example of what it looked like, to see clearly, and act wisely, and trust that the truth, given proper care and sufficient time, would eventually occupy the space where the lie had been. Loy came into the kitchen while I was making the first pot of tea, still in his work clothes from the previous day, having arrived late from the bus. He sat at the kitchen table in his father's chair, at the angle his father had always used, the angle I had never corrected, and he looked at the altar from the kitchen doorway and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She knew this would happen, didn't she? She knew years ago and she prepared for it and she waited." "Yes," I said. "And she trusted you to finish it." "Yes." He was quiet again. Outside, the longan tree moved in the morning breeze, its branches slow and patient, the way they had moved every morning for 36 years, indifferent to which particular morning it happened to be, simply present and continuous, and rooted in the ground that had been its ground since before anyone now living in this house had been born. I poured the tea and set it in front of him and sat down across the table. My grandmother had said it to me when I was a girl too restless to understand it, and Mother had lived it across 83 years without ever needing to say it, and I had spent the past year feeling it in my own body, in the steadiness required to hold something important without moving prematurely, in the patience of keeping still when every instinct wanted to act, in the particular quality of water that shows you nothing on its surface while everything necessary happens below. The deepest water never announces itself, it simply waits. And when it moves, it moves completely. To every mother and father who has been dismissed as too old to matter, too quiet to notice, too tired to fight back, this story is for you. The ones who built everything with patient hands and said nothing while they watched, because they understood that the right moment had not yet arrived. You are not forgotten. You were never as powerless as they believed. If this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe so you never miss the next one. These are the voices that deserve to be heard. We'd love to know. What did this story make you think about? Is there someone in your own life who reminded you of her? Someone who stayed quiet and strong when it would have been so easy to give up?